do you see any off ramps for either of these conflicts? With Ukraine or with Iran?
Not really. I mean, we did have one with Iran before we did what we did. There's no reason why we could not have negotiated a very sensible and effective settlement, a solution to the so-called, Iran nuclear program. Now, even that was not necessary. Again, Iran's nuclear program is under, inspection, very, very intensive inspection by the
Actually,
was. Go ahead.
Just so yeah, I was going to ask about that. So those inspections, like Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan's, the ones that we hit, those were all under inspection.
Yeah.
There were IEA inspectors that'd be on the ground, and they had obviously not when it happened, but they were there and they had full access to everything.
Yeah, right.
And so you don't think that's what we could have just talked to those guys to see how
right. Well, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. It was a fully inspected program. And under more intensive inspection, like 3 times more than the average. I think it was like 21% of resources of the IAEA were devoted to Iran when it was only 7% of the nuclear facilities. And
we had cameras in there, right?
Yeah. And the JCPOA took it even farther, but then Trump tore that up. Right. So it's just like you had a solution. You say, well, the JCPOA was going to expire. Well, the thing to do is renegotiate it. That you already have everything worked out. You can just negotiate renewal. And don't tell me that Pezeshkian wouldn't have. Of course he would. He was, so very naive. He probably would have offered them even more than they had before. But we blew it. We tore up the agreement, and then what we did, of course, just a few weeks ago, we attacked them in the middle of negotiations. Now the IAEA is out of there, and the Iranians almost would be crazy to negotiate with us again. So I don't see a solution. There was one. We had one, for our taking right there. We could have had this JCPOA too, and but unfortunately, Trump listened to the wrong people, and there were always those Israel firsters and Iran war hawks were around him, and they convinced him to do what he did. And now I don't see a solution to it, very sadly. I mean, I really don't. And then with Ukraine, it just, that was always going to be a lot harder. We argued about how the U.S. could have extricated itself if it just really dealt with the reality. And laid the groundwork, made a firm position. This war was a mistake. Ukraine, you're just going to have to accept your losses. But we couldn't do that. That was going to be politically difficult as always. But maybe when the new administration had a lot of political capital, it could have gone in there real hard and taken a true America First position. And I think it would have been, the political elite would have gone crazy. And, they did over some of the moves in that direction. But the people, Trump's base, they would have been happy with it. Yeah, let's just forget about Ukraine. We don't need to do that. It's a European problem, if they want to. And then pulling out, that really would put a huge amount of pressure on the Ukrainians to go to the negotiating table. And then maybe, probably not right away, but at some point, they actually would just say, okay, yeah, we just have to accept reality. But we didn't do that. We had these unrealistic expectations that I was talking about. And so we just dragged on. And now we're in a position where it's just become very, very difficult, to walk away. We failed to change the narrative. The narrative is still Russian aggression that must be stopped, brave Ukraine. And here we are, today Trump is going to give a speech about where he's going to declare himself to be the new Biden when it comes to Ukraine.
Oh, good Lord. I wonder what they told Trump to make him think that we got this. Yeah, you can Trump, you can take on the whole world. I'm sure they have to present some plan. I mean, I can see how if he was just listening to Israeli intelligence and Netanyahu on this Iran thing and Mike Huckabee, Mark Levine, just saying, yeah, this really elaborate scheme that we got this. So it just makes me feel like maybe there's some other plan that he's being fed, that's why he's ready to, okay, yeah, we got this. We can go down this war. Well, one
Yeah.
thing that I'm wondering if this will be a player, we mentioned it before, and I've been hearing about it more, is Azerbaijan being used as a proxy in both of these conflicts. I want to say Colonel Douglas McGregor was saying that the possibility of Azerbaijan invading like northwest Iran. And I think it was Alistair Crook I heard say something about Azerbaijan criminal organizations being potentially behind some of the parts of Operation Spiderweb that were used to carry it out, that the Ukrainians employed Azerbaijani criminal organizations. I don't know if these are true, but just some things I've heard. I don't know if that's potentially a player, and maybe that's like, don't worry, Trump, we got a secret plan. I don't know, but it's like, okay, Azerbaijan against Russia or Iran, like it's a tiny
Well,
country.
and those are all possibilities. I think like in the case of Azerbaijan, it's like Turkey. Turkey doesn't really, Turkey's in NATO, but Turkey is Turkey, and they do have their own ambitions. Sometimes I think we make the mistake because we're looking at the larger geopolitical chessboard that we always think it has to be a white piece or a black piece, and I think like in the case of Turkey and Azerbaijan, that they actually are close allies in some ways. They've been described as joined at the hip. They're gray pieces. They're their own pieces, and sometimes they play with one side and sometimes with the other. And then, particularly in the case of Azerbaijan, they're just plain outright criminal organizations that have a huge degree of influence. And I've heard different arguments. I found actually in this case, like Alexander Mercouris's arguments, and he's apparently has sources in Azerbaijan, who said, yeah, it's really the criminal organizations that are behind this. It's when the Russian government started cracking down on their networks in Russia. They're furious, and they have so much pull. There's actually a great deal of criminal organization influence in the Azerbaijani government. That's really what moved the Azerbaijani government to do what they did, to arrest the journalists and then just seize random citizens and beat them, Russian citizens, and beat them up. Now, there certainly can be a geopolitical aspect to it. It just this happens all the time. One side or the other can kind of find can use one of these players, like under Turkey and like Turkey and Azerbaijan. Turkey sometimes works for the NATO side. Sometimes it helps out the Russians. And right now, Azerbaijan is obviously greatly angering the Russians. It looks like the Russians actually really aren't backing down on this. They've gone ahead with the crackdowns. They haven't stopped cracking down on Azerbaijani criminal networks in Russia. And one thing that I don't think it got much coverage, but one thing that the Azerbaijanis did is that, like, they held up a shipment of, I believe it was onions, from Russia, and they came up with this ridiculous excuse why they couldn't accept the onions. They're trying to put some sort of economic pressure on the Russians. Now, the Russians have come back and have seized peaches and all kinds of things. They say, well, this looks like it violates rule number 5036B, and so they're holding it up. And in the end, I think Russia can actually do more damage, and Azerbaijan probably will have to back down. Now, as for a cooperation between Azerbaijan and Israel, well, that's real. There's this military cooperation. Now, I don't know that they want to actually go so far as to directly attack Iran. That would be very risky. The Iranians Iran is a much bigger country, but who knows?
So, do you think it's pretty safe to say that the CIA and Mossad are funding these criminal organizations for their own benefit to antagonize Russia or Iran?
It's certainly possible. It's very, very possible. There's, this kind of thing happens all the time. Just like, the CIA and Mossad work with Al Qaeda, secretly.
Yeah, we like terrorist organizations and criminal organizations because we can, because you can pay them with, buy them off with guns and money. It's just like we give you the weapons.
Yeah,
they want that stuff.
Right. These people, obviously, just are generally just don't have principles. They don't they're interested in
They're
making
criminals.
money. Yeah, or in the case of Al Qaeda, they're really fixated on like killing Shia. That's the kind of thing. And it's just like, okay, yeah, we don't like the Israelis. We hate almost everybody, but we hate the Shia more, so we'll work with the Israelis. That's what that's what happens.
Yeah, that makes me think about how strong of a grip does Al-Jilani have on Syria? Is his position tenuous?
I think it is. I don't think he has much of a grip at all. It's not a whole lot of information is coming out of Syria, but whatever comes out, whatever I see is bad. And you do get this general impression of chaos. There's not so much like an organized, top down, well, you could say we're repression, certain kinds of laws that put in effect that clearly are, favor the Sunnis over other groups, but not in general, not outright seizure of properties or mass killings or anything. Those are not government sponsored, but there are these people running around with guns. And what was it, like 2 months ago or so, that there were those massacres in Western Syria, mostly of, well, there are Shia Alawites and Christians there, mostly Alawites. Hundreds were killed, and the government, promised to investigate whatever, but nothing's happened. Nobody's been charged. Now, that either happened just, these people just took these gangs took the initiative, these militias, without informing the government, or maybe they told the government, and the government said, sure, it's just is one or the other. There's just a lot of these militias are clearly, either they're acting on their own, there's just a lack of control, or they're working in cahoots with the government. There's maybe the government likes to maintain a certain amount of plausible deniability.
So do you think that that Al-Jilani, or what's he being called now?
Al-Shara.
Al-Shara,
Yeah.
is he going to be, do you think that he will probably be overthrown in not too distant future? And if he does, I mean, is there any chance, do people want Assad back? I mean, I feel like he kind of lost the respect of
Yeah,
most of the world
I
in
think
Syria,
right.
Syrians.
Yeah, no, right. In the end, right, he failed to protect them. I think they would still, yeah. I don't know. It just looks very, very grim from Syria. I don't think Syria is ever going to be put back together again.
No.
The Israeli policy of fragmentation and general weakening really seems to have succeeded in Syria. And there is talk that there will be some kind of peace deal between the Israeli government and al-Jilani or al-Shara, and that would include a recognition of
The Golan.
the Golan Heights, of Israeli ownership of the Golan Heights, and it would also accept certain like buffer zones, that Syrian military units would not be allowed into certain areas in southern Syria, and so essentially the Israelis would maintain a certain, like indirect control over those areas.
Israel's just caused so much destruction for the people in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Just feel bad for everybody in the Middle East. They're just
Yeah,
living
no, I
there,
do
and we
too.
just
Right.
plop this ethno-supremacist state that
Yeah, I
wants to
think. Well,
expand
also,
forever.
like they couldn't have done it. The Israelis. We have to. There is some blame to be apportioned to the people there, not to the majority of people, but to these Sunni extremists who are just so fixated again on killing or defeating their sectarian enemies there that they cooperate with Israel. That's what we've seen in Syria, and we've seen in other places as well.
Hmm.
And that gives, Israel exploits that fact, and so they work together with these forces.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Trump has he been showing any signs of regret for bombing Iran?
No.
And the whole, I mean, I just got to think he's got to be like, man, this did not work out. I messed up.
I don't think he thinks that way. I don't think he's.
You don't think?
Yeah, I think he's incapable of really admitting something like that. I just don't think so. It's
I
still the
feel like
most
he
awesome
has
thing.
to feel. It was just such
Right.
a, I mean, I think that was such a horrible move. The way that it was done during the negotiations, just
Yeah.
destroying
Right.
any idea of the U.S. being a good
Right.
guy, was just
Yeah, no,
evaporated
it
at that
was it
point.
was disastrous. I mean, again, it's just like there was a solution waiting for you. You could have taken it, and now it's gone. There's just no solution now. It's
Right. And they got the crazy thing. They just had to play it off as a win, but it's just going to come back by. It's like you have no eyes on the situation now. You had all these cameras, inspectors on the
right,
ground that have access to everything. Now you got
yeah,
nothing, and now it's like
right,
now who knows? And then now they might be building a nuke.
right,
Uh, what a mess. What
yeah,
our decision making is just it's so bad. It's
yeah,
so bad here. Our federal
yeah,
government is just such a joke, and I think
right,
that in itself is just that's the a death knell. I think nail in the coffin for the U.S. empire, just in itself.
right.
Just the fact that everybody can see, just like, yeah, your country is insane. Your leadership, your system sucks. This is what it
Yeah,
does. Like
yeah. Well, more and more people are seeing that. I mean, it's just like in the case of Iran's nuclear program. It's not, this was the kind of the culmination. It was one terrible decision on top of another. And there's been a series of terrible decisions that have led us to where we are. Originally going back to the 1980s, the Islamic Republic had inherited this nuclear program from the previous regime, from the Shah, and um, and at first they didn't do much with it, and then they said, yeah, we need this. This is something. Billions of dollars have already been invested. This would be good for us to have. Let's start it up. But we what we'll do is we'll just buy the enriched uranium. You can actually get in the form of like fuel rods, which can't be further enriched. That's 3.7%, and power these nuclear reactors. But the U.S. actually just shut that down. So it was because the U.S. and Israel and other powers prevented them from just doing this that they went for enrichment. Now enrichment is completely legal, but then that raised all these red flags, all this this alarm. So it's just like it's one thing after the other. And it's a very similar thing happened actually in North Korea. We had a deal with the North Koreans. We actually did that. We will provide some of this nuclear technology to you and help you run it, but at the same time make sure that you don't enrich too high and create nuclear weapons. And the North Koreans agreed to it. They actually dismantled the facilities that they had, and then um, the U.S. reneged on the deal. What happens is I think you have some people that are smart and well intentioned within the U.S. government, and they understand what's going on, and they help to work out these deals. But then you have these crazies that are always in the wing, and they're just trying to do what they can to torpedo or sabotage these things, and so we end up in these terrible outcomes. The John Bolton, for example, in the case of North Korea. But then we have there are plenty of suspects in the case of Iran.
yeah, when we're making all these consecutive bad decisions. I mean, in the case of Iran, I mean, we have to point the finger at Israel. This is the only reason we're making these bad decisions, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the only decision. I think it is them. They are the main driver. It clearly have been for decades. They have had this obsession. Remember, I think it was the chief editor of Middle East
Middle
Spectator,
East
maybe.
Eye
Just or
or Spectre, I don't know.
yeah. But anyway, he was saying like he actually met Netanyahu in the early 2000s, and the first thing that Netanyahu told him is, "We have to get Iran. We have to." That's what he would tell a lot of people just first off. So this is something that goes back. There's been this steady pressure from Israel. So yeah, I think they're the main driver of it. But there also always have been Americans that have been obsessed with bringing down the regime in Iran, even independent of Israel. So there is another element there. Like going back when the Shah was overthrown, there was a real shock to the Americans. He was a really important part of their um, their role in the Middle East. This is where this was a great power, as a way that they controlled the region was through him. They lost him, and so it's like after that they say we got to get these people are going to resist us. we have to get somebody back in there who cooperates with us. So there is a kind of a pure, more geopolitical, you could even call it America first of some kind, um, ideology behind it. But yeah, it seems like the passion, the real extreme pressure has been coming from the Israel firsters.
It's the only good thing I could say is that it's becoming more and more apparent to people that a lot of this is coming from Israel, and Israel's to blame for a lot of the death and destruction and our involvement in the Middle East. So hopefully we continue to see that trend grow and there could be some real change. I just wonder at what point, when will that happen?
Yeah,
It takes a while.
right. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, because I've just seen this, the way things are. It was the way things have been for decades and decades. But every order falls, and sometimes these established way of doing things can collapse very, very quickly. We may be surprised.